Welcome back, everybody, to His Heartbeat. Once again, I've got a wonderful guest. I have a doctor this time, Dr. Amanda McNeil. Welcome to our show.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here.
Yeah, well, it's great to have you. And she has her doctorate in counseling and what was the other half?
Theology and psychology. Yeah,
There you go.
it's a mouthful.
Okay, that's a good blend, I think. Yeah, so my degree's in Christian counseling, so probably similar. Yeah.
Yeah,
But that is
absolutely.
great. And we're going to talk today uh, about grief, but I like how you talk about grief with God. And
Mm,
so I thought we might get into, some new aspects. But before we do, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
yeah. Well, my favorite job in the world is mom.
Yay,
We
thank
have
you.
yeah, it's fun. We have a miracle baby who is now 9, so it's hard to call him a baby. But he's such a joy. My husband and I run our own private counseling and coaching practice, and we serve as pastors in our local church as part of a team of pastors that teach at our church. And so we wear many hats. Um, Even we joke like we have business meetings and then we have marriage meetings, and never the two shall cross
Yeah.
because that can get complicated. But I'm really grateful how God has orchestrated all the passions of my heart to make sense. When it feels like they could be in different lanes, He made a way for them to all come together. And so I'm very honored to be serving so many people in many directions, all pointing them to the hope of Jesus.
Amen. Why do you call your son a miracle baby?
So, my husband and I are very type A personalities. We are very structured, we're very organized. I call my calendar Skittles throw up because everything's in its place. And so, of course, naturally, when we got married, we planned when we were going to expand our family with children. And right when our plan happened, I started having some physical issues, and we navigated infertility for over a year and lots of different dynamics, PCOS, just all kinds of things. And I remember I saw my doctor a week before Christmas, and she basically said, "It's going to be really hard for you to get pregnant." And my
Oh,
husband wasn't with me. We didn't know it was going to be that like big deal of an
mm,
appointment.
mm,
So that was just shattering, especially around the holidays. It's you
mm.
never want to get that news, but the next day I was at a Christmas party and someone's like, "So when are you going to have kids?" And
Oh, that's
so
so hard.
carrying that, yeah. And so I'm grateful. I know infertility journeys are different. There's different types, there's different lengths. I'm grateful. Ours was about a year, which of course felt so long when we were in it. But the moment he was in our arms, it was like, oh, all that waiting was worth it because if I had gotten pregnant sooner or later, it wouldn't have been him. So I'm very grateful just to have that kind of love and appreciation for who he is in our lives.
So I'm guessing that you learned a lot through that period of time.
Oh, yes, ma'am. It's very hard to be a control freak and not to be able to control
Mm,
anything, but especially such a tender, hard season.
mm. So what did you learn through that?
Oh, goodness. Um, I actually had to learn a lot of lessons. I learned some throughout, but I had to learn a lot after in hindsight, once I was able to really reflect on it.
Mm.
And um, I am a very private person naturally. What's funny that I live my life on stages and I share things all the time, and yet I'm still very a private person. Um, and so when we got that diagnosis, it really took me a long time to tell anybody about it. We
Mm.
told our pastors and we told our parents. And then a couple weeks later, we told one couple who are very close friends because I was processing pain and it was hard to talk about. And so I didn't know how to talk about it. And in hindsight, I wish I would have opened up more and invited more support and more community.
Mm.
But when you're grieving, when you're processing pain, it's like you have an open wound and you're trying to protect yourself. And unfortunately, sometimes people say things that are well-meaning but not well
Yeah.
spoken. And it can be hard to know who's a safe person to share sensitive information with. But I learned that I need to pursue community and allow community in because naturally I would isolate.
Yeah. So did you go through that period of depression and what did that look like?
I um I was definitely sad. I wouldn't say it was a deep depression because this also wasn't the first type of grief I had navigated in my life. And yet, actually, that was a point of contention with me and God, right? Because I
Mm.
was like, my previous grief was more visceral, was uglier, and
Mm.
I chose to use a really good attitude, God. So I should get like some kind of pass go,
Reward.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, like I shouldn't have to suffer again because I did it right
Mhm.
the first time. I did it
Oh,
well. This isn't fair. And so I really had to wrestle with God, but I came to the conclusion for myself that I didn't believe God would put it in my heart to be a mother, for him to withhold that fulfillment from me. And so I just had to stand on the word about God's character and his goodness and his faithfulness and trust through the pain and through his ways not being my ways and his timing not being my timing. And so I tend to lean into faith even when I'm mad at God, and I tell him when I'm mad at him.
yeah. So what was it like? Like what was, if I can ask, the first round of grief, what was that about? And, did that look different? You said you did it well, but what do you mean by that?
Yeah. So this whole journey of why I even got into the mental health field and Christian counseling started when I was 14 years old. My father, who was a missionary and an eye doctor, um, wasn't a perfect man, but was such a good dad and lover of Jesus. He got into an airplane accident and passed away very suddenly.
Oh, wow.
So, without warning, I was 14 years old. My mom became a widow, and I leaned into Jesus. And I
Mm.
remember even hours after the accident, screaming, crying. I actually describe it in my book as like the most beautiful and yet ugliest worship that has ever come from my mouth because it was so pure and so emotionally dysregulated. Um, but I remember running to God and I just felt him in my spirit say, when people face tragedy, they only have two choices. They can choose to run toward me or they can try to run away from me. And because you've chosen to run toward me, I'm going to carry you all of your life. And I clung to that. I was a fatherless girl who had an encounter with Father God that changed everything for my life in a really beautiful way. So I definitely didn't navigate that grief perfectly, but I did choose to lean into God and to lean into faith and to lean into hope. And you know how like teenagers have no chill, like no filter? I remember like telling him, like, God, your word says in Romans 8:28 that you cause all things to work together for the good of those who love you and are called to your purposes. I don't see how you can work this together for good in my life, but I don't believe you're a liar, so you have to prove yourself. And over and over again, he has proved it, and he has used my story and my ability to relate with people in difficult grief situations. And it's like every time I get to share about it, even in this moment, every time I get to sit with a client, every time someone tells me about my book, it is trading of beauty for the ashes of my life. And it's such a privilege.
Good title. That's the name of our ministry.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we have our primary message is called Beauty for Ashes, but yeah. Um, Yeah, you were saying earlier that it wasn't perfect, but then I kind of want to say, is grief ever perfect? You know, grief is
Good point.
messy, right?
Mhm.
It's messy. And if you think it's perfect, then you're probably being too controlling, you know, and it'll bite
Yeah,
you in the bottom later, I think, right? You know,
totally.
if I just do step one, two, three, then this pain will go away. And usually that doesn't work. And if it does, it might mean that you just kind of stuffed it down there, would you say?
Totally. Yes, we are all looking for the formula to feel better.
Yeah.
Like, give me the checklist to get over my grief. Give me the formula for success. And I think our mental health, but also even our spiritual health, isn't so linear, and we can't
Yeah.
just check a box to get to a finish line or to achieve an award. It is messy, it is relational, it is one step forward, sometimes a few steps sideways, but it's by continuing to show up and continuing to engage that that's how healing happens.
So the fact that it is so messy, how do you meet people in their grief? I mean, there isn't one prescription. It's not like that kind of doctor.
No,
But
no.
but yeah, how does I'm sure the Lord guides you, but I don't know, just bring us into your world. What
Yeah,
is your feeling going into a new counseling situation?
yeah. I am a firm believer how the word calls the Holy Spirit our counselor, that God is ultimately our counselor. And I am honored to be a vessel and do my best to listen and echo his counsel in the word. Um, and so when someone's grieving, it kind of depends on where they are at in the grief processing journey and the type of relationship or event or thing that they are grieving. So it's very different to engage with someone who is grieving a sibling from 3 years ago versus grieving a widow grieving her spouse from 2 weeks ago.
Mm,
They're at different stages in their process. There's different
mm,
weight to the relationship that was lost. But then also, there's people who are grieving that wouldn't necessarily categorize it as grief
yeah.
if they, lose a job or an opportunity or have to move across the country or something of that nature. There's loss involved, but people sometimes only categorize grief as bereavement or the loss of a person. So, a more direct answer to your question is I do my best to meet people where they're at, to see where the need is, to see what they're ready to engage in, because healing tender places requires gentleness. And I can't push someone or want someone to go into territory that they aren't willing or ready to do so. So it starts with a lot of listening and empathy and hearing where they are. And people deal with emotions in different ways. Like you said, a lot of people try to stuff it, avoid it. Let's move on like it didn't happen. Let's just get back to feeling better. Other people really struggle with anger and trying to logically process something, but they don't think they struggle with the emotional, and it's kind of masked in anger or
Mm,
logic. And so, meeting people where they are and trying to help them connect all of those pieces
mm,
together
yeah.
is it's just so unique to every person in every situation.
Do you tend to uh, try to help them link it to past grief? You know what I mean? Like a lot of
Mm,
times the intensity of a current grief. I mean, you even brought it up in your situation,
yeah.
how what happened with your dad, that's gonna rise up again, right? When you go into a new grief. Do you kind of let them bring that up, or do you ask the question like, "Hey, do you feel like you've gone through similar feelings to this before?"
I think again, it kind of depends on where they're at and what they're willing to dive into. But I do, with most clients, eventually get to some story work and some reflection on our life experiences
Mm,
because our story informs how we show up to things and how we process things, both consciously and non-consciously. Um, So I could give you a little bit of an example of that,
Sure.
a light one, an easy one. When we were first married, I would tell my husband, like, we were in grad school, we were working in nonprofit. We just, we didn't have a lot of money. We were trying to get through grad school with as little debt as possible. So I was like, don't buy me flowers. That's a waste of money because they die anyway. And I firmly believed it was me being budget conscious. And it wasn't until later in my own personal counseling journey and story work journey that I realized, oh, actually, the smell of dying flowers takes me
Mhm.
back to my
Mhm.
father's death.
Wow. Wow.
And something that's meant or traditionally thought of as a romantic gesture being a subconscious trigger to grief, I would have never connected those dots had I not done the work to step into understanding my story in a deep way.
Yeah, I remember in our counseling program, one of our assignments, I don't know if you did this, but is to do a linear grief chart of your life. So you have the thing where you do like major events. There's that one.
Hmm.
And I've done that at different conferences, but this one was like, no, all your points of grief, as simple as, losing your best friend in first grade because she moved away,
Yeah.
things like that, or that your dad never bought that pink bicycle for you that you really thought he was going to do it. Just as simple as that, but you'd mark it like the age, the year, and this whole chart, like a
Hmm.
linear chart. And then we were to put in there the emotions that if we knew, we could recall at that time. And it was really interesting to do that. It gave you a lot of insight into how you grieve now,
Hmm.
and how you're processing things now and what is behind that. And also, we're a big proponent in Crown of Beauty of helping people discover the lies versus the truth. So you
Yeah.
also, in those grieving times, that's the time the enemy likes to put zingers in there and remove
Yes.
lies. And that is really incredibly painful. Like, that can be more painful than the event itself. Like, for
Yeah.
example, my dad left us. Well, that was obviously deep grief and loss, and there's loneliness in that and disappointment and all that, but also the lie of, why did he leave? It must have been me.
Hmm.
And carrying that, it's like you can get over the loneliness, the loss of him not being there. Your mom remarried and whatever. We kept spending time with dad, but it looked different. But that lie that was planted at that time carries all the way into adult life, in my 50s, you know.
Yeah. Yes, it's so true. I think humbling was the word that came to mind because I remember doing that same chart. And it's like,
Mm,
oh, wow, there's a lot that, again, if I were to explain my life to someone, I might have not categorized it as grief, but it
right.
is. And even something like that pink bicycle, planting the seed of, am I not worthy of love or
Mm,
am I not worthy of follow through? And that message, that lie-based message,
yeah.
absolutely affects our relationships moving forward.
So do you have your ears open for that as people are telling their story?
Oh, yes. I forget who said it, so I can't properly attribute the quote, but there's a quote that I love on this topic of children make excellent observers, but horrible interpreters.
Mm,
And this is because
true.
in our developmental stage, a child makes everything about themselves.
Mm,
So, to that point of dad left, what did I do wrong? Is a child's way of processing, oh, well, it must have been because of something I did. Because children are taking in all this information, both that's blatantly told to them, and what's maybe not blatantly told, but we can observe. And then we interpret it through our limited development at that
Yeah.
stage.
Yeah.
And so that's why, as adults, we have this hard work of digging in to find the roots of where these beliefs started, how to uproot them and replace them with truth-based thinking. And that is a huge journey.
Yeah. I've seen there's so much individualization in all of this, but I've also seen that the way that we not just process, that's going to be different for each person, but what brings us joy or relief or release from the pain is it's not a patent thing. It's
Mhm.
not, oh, well, if I can just get them to do this, which is kind of why I think those little pat answers can really be painful because what worked for that one person, when it's, oh, when my brother died, blah, blah, blah,
Yep.
it might be meaningless to you, it's not
Yeah.
what's going to get you over the wall of grief. Yeah.
Yes. Well, because relationships can't be compared, and therefore grief can't be compared. My relationship with my brother is vastly different from somebody else's relationship with their brother. And so the way we process pain, the way we, um, I think, like you said, release it, it does look different.
Yeah.
And I encourage clients to experiment. And I really like that
Good.
word because
Like
I
that.
think sometimes we think there's a formula and I either do it
No.
right and it works or I do it wrong and it doesn't
Yeah.
work. But
And they come to you, hey,
experimenting,
doc, tell
yeah,
me, how do I get rid of this pain?
literally, yes. Um, and I like that word experiment because if you picture scientists in a lab, they're trying hundreds, if not thousands, of variations before they find what works. But all of the fails along the way are still helpful data of, okay, this formula isn't for me, or this isn't what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
And so we turn the knobs to see what serves me well, what supports my values and my faith, and draws me closer to the Lord and allows me to move through the pain rather than ignoring or suppressing the pain or allowing the pain to take over my whole life.
Yeah, and you might have experienced this with your husband. There was a couple that I know that were in our church and their son died tragically.
Mm,
And like immediately, unexpectedly kind of accident. And the way that she dealt with her grief and the way the husband dealt with the grief were night and day. And so he just ran into his job. He just lost himself
mm.
in work, work, work. But he kind of needed to at that point, the immediate shock and the incredible pain. It's like he wanted his life to feel something to feel normal
Yes,
because when he went home, there was nothing normal about it. His
right.
son was gone, and but the mother, she wanted to cry. She wanted everybody to know about it. She wanted everybody to grieve with her. She wanted all kinds of like, let's have a memory of this person, celebrated with the baseball team and with the da 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 da.
Mm,
And and that was hard for him because he's kind of almost like, let's move on. It was
yep.
hard for her because how can you be like that? Don't you care about our son? And others viewing it could, depending on what they're like, could think, some might be like, get on with your life. They just had a new baby. Just you have that new baby now, and then other
Mm,
people be to him like, come on, you're stuffing your emotion. You're not dealing with it. So I
yep.
really saw like the challenge that that kind of loss brings to a family. You must have felt
Mhm.
that yourself, but also encounter that in your counseling.
Yeah, well, even as a pastor,
Yeah.
my first funeral was for a young boy, and
Mm.
it
Oh gosh.
it it was so hard to watch the family navigate that. So Again, while losses can't be compared, typically the most challenging losses to process are of a spouse, a parent, or a child, those closest
Mm,
relationships. It's incredibly painful, and you can't have a clue what a person is going through until you've walked that path
mm,
yourself. And then you have so much compassion and um, it can be very isolating. So with something very isolating, and then if you have a temperament like mine that's very private and isolating anyway, it can be a recipe for questioning your faith,
yeah,
being hard-hearted to building new relationships, because why would I let someone get close if there's risk of losing somebody else in my life? The heart is very complex in that sense, I think.
yeah. How do you deal with it if someone, both, church or client, comes and they say, well, there must not be a God. I want nothing, or if there is, I want nothing to do with him because God was supposed to be loving and there's nothing loving about this. What do you do with that?
Yeah. Um, So it'd be very different if I had my pastor hat on or if I had my counselor hat on. But I think either way, I would empathize with them. And I would say, yeah, this is awful. This isn't loving. This isn't good. I'm so sorry you're in this. This is horrible. I wouldn't wish this on anyone. And if they were open to it, I would share my perspective that I had to come through my own journey with grief. And when people know you've experienced something really hard, they
Yeah.
tend to listen like, oh, okay, she's not just saying platitudes to make me
Yeah.
feel better. Like
True.
she's felt this too. She's been through this too. And so if they were open to it, I would share my perspective on how when God created us originally in Genesis, he created a perfect world and he created perfect humanity. There was no sickness, there was no depression, there was no mental illness, there was no cancer, there were no accidents. Everything worked in perfect, harmonious design. And once sin entered the world, that's when everything changed. And sin causes death, sin causes disaster, sin causes disease. And so I share my personal view that God grieves with us because he never intended for us to experience death on this earth, because death didn't exist until after sin did. And I don't believe God is pleased by the sin nature of the earth or is pleased by death or disaster or rape or any other huge trauma. I believe he aches and he longs for redemption through Jesus as much as we long for redemption.
Do you have any, maybe it's in your own book, but any books that would uh, help people because with the confusion where they struggle with, um, but he could have done something, right?
Mm,
He does miracles. He has the power. He split the sea. He da 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 da.
yeah.
So what do I do with that? Yeah.
Yeah, so what I just shared about Genesis, I actually give away in my first chapter of my own book. And to that point of he could have, I also address that. And I reference, the Hebrew men. I don't know, some people call them Hebrew boys, but it's like the Hebrew boys. That sounded country. But of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego with the fiery furnace. And I think of that kind of faith where their lives were threatened very publicly. And they had the audacity to say, our God will rescue us from the fiery furnace. But even if he doesn't, he's still God.
Hmm.
And I had to wrestle with that on my own journey, even with infertility. Like, do I believe God can heal and God can provide and God can restore? Yes. But even if he doesn't, that's a different kind of faith. And I don't think that's the kind of faith that we can get to quickly or flippantly. I think that
Yeah.
requires very intentional contemplation and wrestling with our belief system about who God is and what his character is toward us.
Yeah, I agree. That's in some ways that's why I think it's better to have like those kind of books that deal with that, as opposed to me sharing eh, kind of that kind of perspective.
Mm.
Like they have to wrestle through a whole book that kind
Yes.
of tells you all the different perspectives and, not well, in one verse or one section of scripture or and bottom line is I forget who I heard this recently, but like if you're if you don't see God as mysterious and unexplainable, then you don't really know the same God I do.
Mhm.
That's how
It's
they put it.
beautiful.
And I mean, that's kind of the bottom line is there really isn't a clear-cut answer, I
Yeah.
mean, sometimes you can, when my parents passed away, one 2 years ago, one recently, but they were quite old, and they were getting to that point of suffering.
Mm.
So I think that there's a, like you said, there's a different kind of loss depending on that. So for me,
Yeah.
there was joy found in knowing they're with God in heaven. And they're
Yes.
having I say that you're having the time of your life today, aren't you? If I'll kind of talk to them a little bit. And um, yeah, I think, but I know people that's not a comfort to them because at the
Sure.
same time, I do really, really miss my mom a lot. So even knowing that, I'll tell her, okay, I know you're having time of your life, but I miss you. But
Yeah.
I also don't, I thought, hey, but I don't want you here going through what you're going through. So yeah,
And I
so
think
yeah, go ahead.
I think that's one of the hardest parts about progressing through grief. So there's obviously the initial processing,
Mm,
but what you're talking about is reintegrating into life. And I think the challenge is carrying those dual emotions of I can have grief and gratitude at the same time. I can be
yeah,
sad and I can make new joyful memories at the same time. And I don't think there's any time that is a good time to lose your parent, no
yeah,
matter how old you are or how full her days are. And yet, that knowing that she's no longer suffering, that she's healed and whole,
yeah,
that it's grief and gratitude.
yeah. Yeah, and different things help different people.
Mm.
For me, reading books about eternity, I've talked about in my show a lot, but that is really helpful. But, some things, even the memory, you can get triggered, like the loss of your dog, and then you see somebody enjoying their dog. Or I know for me, my kids, like my daughter, gosh, she moved out 3 years ago, maybe. And my son is in and out, sometimes here, sometimes not, but very busy. But just that once your kids, that empty nesting, once they grow up, and even if they live there, but they're in their own world, you're not that mom anymore, who's going to their soccer games and
Yeah.
that kind of thing. And it just hit me the other day, like there's an element that there's still a grief going on because I know when I see moms and they're with their cute little kids, I went to a tea shop and the dad's there with his little girl and it's like, oh,
Yeah.
yeah. So some things they just kind of keep going and you have to keep dealing with it.
Hmm. Yeah, I think there's so many stages of grief in parenthood. And you described it beautifully because as our children grow and are becoming more independent, and needing us less, that's a change in the dynamic. And grief is sadness over loss. So, someone doesn't have to die for us to experience loss. There's
Right.
change in the relationship. And the sadness doesn't have to take over our whole life, but it does need to be acknowledged because it's the reality of the change. And when we process it, we can move through it and we can continue to build happy memories and be present, but it's complicated.
So journaling can help a lot in that, right?
Yeah, there's so much science to how journaling helps us. And I know some people like love journaling, some people hate journaling.
Yeah.
And so I always say it's not about my opinion. The science is there. Um, Dr. Caroline Leaf, she's a neuroscientist, and she describes it as, if you have a messy bed sheet thrown into the closet and there's a speck of dirt somewhere wadded up, you can know there's something not set right. And journaling is mentally like unfolding the bed sheet, finding the speck of dirt, removing it, and then being able to neatly fold the bed sheet. And so journaling is about helping us process in a concrete way. When we keep thoughts and emotions in our head, they're abstract, they're constantly moving and changing. But writing something on paper or typing it on a screen helps us make it a little more concrete to be able to process.
Yeah, you might be able to do it verbally, I would guess. Just record it kind of thing
Mhm.
if you're not into writing.
Yes, many auditory processors, I do recommend that too. And then they'll be like, I still didn't do it. I'm like, okay. There's the grace for your pace.
Yeah, yeah. But even having somebody to talk to is really helpful. Yeah.
Yeah,
But you do have to be careful who you talk to for
for
sure.
sure.
Okay. Well, that's good. So tell us about your book, the name, and what got you to write it. And
Yeah. Oh, that's a whole story. It's called Overcoming the Overcast, Navigating the Storms of Grief with God. And I knew since that moment with God when he said, I'm gonna keep you. I said, God, prove good in my life. I knew counseling would be a part of my journey. I didn't totally have the full picture of it then, of course. And I knew that walking alongside others in their grief was going to be part of my story. And so years ago, I wrote a book and I was like, you know what? I feel like I need to have doctor on my name before anyone will take me seriously. And so I kind of shelved it.
it does help a little.
In some circles, yes, or some
Yes.
people who
I'm
are
not. Yeah.
skeptical, yeah. Um, and then the Lord really had a refining work in me through many different circumstances. And I finally started writing the book, the book Overcoming the Overcast in particular. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to do it even without doctor. That's not really on my radar. After my master's degree, I was like, I'm done with school. And I would do little things in continuing education here and there. But I was like, I don't want to throw myself into a whole doctoral program in this season. But I was obedient to write the book because every time I would have coffee with someone or walk with a family at church through grief, I was saying things, with similar themes, similar scriptures. And so I was like, I need to get my book out there. People need this message of hope that we can question our faith and question God without our faith falling apart, even when it feels like our life is falling apart. And as a lifelong church kid, I saw so many people turn away from God because of tragedy or because of seemingly unanswered prayers. And so this was my love letter in an effort for people to ground their theology. Maybe they read it before they've had a big loss, and so they can know how to process that loss. Or maybe a loss has shaken their faith, and this can be a compassionate guide to walk alongside them in processing that. And when I finished the book, the first draft, I brought it to my mentor, who is a professor at a university. And I didn't bring it for that reason. I just brought it to thank her for all she's done pouring into me and teaching me. And she said, this is essentially a PhD thesis, and you only need to change a few things to get your doctorate. And I was like,
Oh,
oh,
wow.
really? And so
Oh,
the timing of the book going through edits and rewrites, and I had to finish up just a few things for my PhD. I thought that was like a cool, like God wink
yeah,
that I
that's
got to
neat.
publish it with Doctor. So yeah, it's been a long journey, but it truly is a love letter for those who want to navigate faith while asking really honest, painful questions about faith and about God.
Wow, that's really helpful this time. I think you're right. A lot of people have given up on God.
Mhm.
You know, a lot of people giving up on church.
Yeah,
That's not necessarily great, but the bigger problem is giving up on God, you know, because church is not God, you know, but
totally.
community. I always tell my kids, but community, you need Christian community.
Yeah,
And that's biblical. We need that community of people that we can be ourselves and trust and share and pray and be learning some things together from God's
yeah.
word.
Well, to your point earlier about lie-based thinking, if we believe lies about God and his character, we're not going to want to be in relationship with him. That is going to be a repellent. And so we have to have that accurate view of who he is, despite how the church is
Mm,
imperfect, despite
yeah.
how people fail us, despite how circumstances aren't necessarily what we prayed for, to see a little bit more of the overall picture of his goodness and his presence in our life.
Yeah, that's good. We in our Beauty for Ashes conference, our second message talks about lies and truths about God, and we bring up the story of Jesus in the boat with the disciples. Jesus is sleeping, and they're like, "Don't you care if we drown?" You know, and they really were so angry because they didn't truly understand or cling to the truth of who God is. You know, even though they'd see miracles, but you know, when you get into really stressful situations, sometimes you begin to question and doubt God, and they felt their life was threatened, even though Jesus said we're going to the other side. You know,
Yeah.
and then in our Crown of Beauty book, in the middle of the book, lesson 5, again, we deal with the lies and truths, but we do the Elijah story and what caused him to go into depression, you know,
Hmm.
here when he had the most amazing experience
Yeah.
and test of incredible faith right
Immediately
before.
after. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yep.
then boom, he just crashes. So we talk about potentially a lie that he was believing is that God used him, but didn't necessarily love himself, you know,
Mm,
and care about him just for who he is, but rather he cared about him to do God's work. But it's
mm,
like, you know, God came in a whisper because he cared about him, no
yes.
matter what he did. And you know, it's really beautiful. And then he met his physical needs, his friendship needs, you know, the whole thing. So anyway, yeah, but very cool. Well, there's a lot here. Um, but I know there's a lot more that you share in your book. So y'all go on Amazon, right?
Yes, ma'am. Yep. It's on Amazon and it's on my personal website, amandacmcneil.com.
Amanda C. McNeil.com. Okay,
Yep.
that'll be our show notes. And Overcoming the Overcast, Navigating the Storms of Grief with God. Yeah, well,
Yeah.
thank you so much, Doc.
Thank you so much for
Oh,
sharing.
the freebie session, y'all. How you like
Yeah.
that?
I
So,
love these kinds of conversations because it's honest, it's real life.
yeah. So I think, you know, go journal, you guys. I've been doing some journaling myself. Just even change. We're in some transitions and change can include grief because you're leaving something that is not it's not going to be there again.
Yeah.
Even though you're in this waiting stage till something new, and that can be hard. But yeah, well, thank you so much, Amanda.
You are welcome. Thank you for having me, Sue. I appreciate it.
It was fun. And y'all come back now. Sound like, isn't that in Beverly Hillbillies or something?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, but looking forward to having you all again next week. But please share this with others. And yeah, check both of our websites out, crownofbeautyinternational.com and say yours again.
AmandaCMcNeil.com.
There you go. All right. Take care, everybody.